For better or worse, I am very much myself in all of my videos, and I hope that throughout all of that, I can at least avoid the label of generic. That being said, when I say Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition has been out for a bit, and its new ending is very controversial among the fanbase, I feel like the most generic YouTuber I've ever been in my life. I don't know, it's a correct statement, I can't think of a better way to phrase it, and this is far from the first time this has happened in the series, which is something about those words in that order makes me feel like one of the million Buzz Lightyears on the shelf. I guess it is just a rite of passage for YouTuber talking about media, because eventually every franchise is gonna have something like this. Anyway though, it's very possible that this divided opinion on the ending is only something that exists now, soon after the game's release, and when we look back on it with the benefit of hindsight, maybe some people's opinions will shift a bit. This is the angle I want to approach it from today, and because I'm talking about the ending, as well as potential future games, I am going to be spoiling every single Xenoblade this time. I hope that's okay. I'm honestly really glad I don't need to specify the numbered trilogy anymore when I do videos like this. From what I've been able to observe, there is a lot of correlation between opinion on the epilogue and how highly you rank Xenoblade X versus the other games in the series, plus how long you've been a fan of X specifically. This is not a hard and fast rule, so if you're not near this line of best fit, I'm not saying you don't exist, I'm just saying you're not falling into the general trend. It is far more likely for someone who played the original Wii U version of Xenoblade X back in 2015 when it first came out, and was disappointed when Xenoblade 2 was announced for the Switch and not a follow-up to X's cliffhangers, to be disappointed with the new ending than someone who either played X for the first time with DE, or was maybe more in the camp of having been a Xenoblade 1 fan before 2015, played X when it came out, didn't like it because they wanted something closer to the original Xenoblade 1, then got that when Xenoblade 2 came out and never really went back to X until now. Honestly, as far as the general plot direction of Chapter 13 goes, this was probably the worst time to have all this stuff happen in terms of overall enjoyment factor from especially well-established fans. If this was the overall ending of the 2015 Xenoblade X, and there were just more chapters, I'm assuming a better paced version of Chapter 13 in this case, on the original story, then yeah, people would probably not like Mira getting destroyed, but also they wouldn't have 10 years worth of Mira-related cliffhangers to stew on. And if they made a proper Xenoblade X2 that eventually built up to this ending over a full game, where we get to explore Mira more, and eventually come to terms with the fact that we're going to say goodbye to it, I think that would have also gone over a lot better, especially if they did explain a lot more of Mira's mysteries along the way. There was just no way this short a new storyline with this overall plot direction was going to live up to the anticipation, speculation, and headcanons people had been building for a literal decade. And while I don't think there's really any scenario, even including a full X2, that would have completely an extra 3 chapters that escalate things far more than the entire original game story did certainly weren't. Now, this is far from the first time a Xenoblade ending has been widely disliked or controversial. You just need to look back to the original X to see proof of that. But I think the most interesting comparison point is Xenoblade 3. When that game first came out, I honestly think its ending was as controversial and as argued about as XDE's new ending is, but now that about 3 years have passed, it seems like the general consensus is overall a lot more positive. I think an interesting question to ask is, could that also happen here? Could the opposite happen and general consensus shift for the worse? And what factors could cause things to shift either way? The first things to consider are 2 reasons why, especially very early on, opinions might shift to the negative. The first is people seeing leaks and getting spoiled, and finding out things or viewing scenes out of context, and not knowing how things got to there in the first place. The second is just that the people who beat the game earlier and will see the ending earlier are the ones who rush through it the most. And I do think in both cases, the less side content you do, the worse the ending will come off. In 3's case, there are a lot of optional quests, some of which can only be done after beating the game, which is its own issue, that give major pieces of explanation or exposition to important things and even major characters, as well as some very heavy subtext that hints that the ending is a lot less bitter on the bittersweet scale than it would come off if you just mainlined the story. In X's case, I think the longer time you spend just soaking in the vibes and doing as much content as you want, as well as especially the amount of side content you do in between Chapter 12 and 13, the less it stings to lose Mira, because the more you've spent there, and the more it has actually felt like home, and that they didn't just recover the Lifehold core, then the next day the entire planet started disintegrating. I will say there's exactly one good thing that comes from the gap in time between 12 and 13 being so short canonically, is that it means Luxar doing his whole thing, crashing out on the Lifehold core, missed the Great One showing up by like 2 weeks at most, and I think that's absolutely hilarious. Just not enough to outweigh all the other issues the small time skip causes. The other really big thing they have in common is that at the end of the game, the world is completely destroyed, and that can easily and pretty reasonably give the sense that nothing we did throughout the entire game really mattered. The real difference is in how it goes about happening across the two games. In Xenoblade 3, Ionios existing in the first place is a bad thing, and destroying it is a very good thing, so ultimately the world we get invested in throughout the game going away by the end of it is a positive outcome, but also, because of the way the world works, nobody's going to remember anything that happened during the game when they get reincarnated back into their new, better lives. At most, the events of Xenoblade 3 will be remembered by a select few characters like A and maybe Shulk and Rex, and for the rest just be kinda experiences engraved on people's souls. On X's side, Mira existing is a very good thing. It is a haven for people fleeing destruction, and may have even been created for that on purpose, and the entire game builds up how it's going to become a new home for humanity, where we're building new lives here, and are going to stay here until it's time for us to spread our wings and take to the stars again. Then Chapter 13 just completely wipes that out, and everything's up in the air again, and it looks like we might just be repeating the same thing on this brand new planet, but without the crashing spaceship. On the flip side, though, everyone on the White Whale 2 is just every friendly sentient person who was alive on Mira, and they'll be landing on this new planet with all their memories from Mira completely intact, so if there is a direct follow-up to X, all the stuff that happened in the first game will be immediately relevant because everyone knows it happened and has all the character development and knowledge and experience that came from that. If we see Noah and Mio again, they're going to be a musician and sprinter, they're going to feel drawn to each other inherently, and they're probably going to have some innate talent with longsword and twin rings, but they probably won't remember coming together to defeat Consul K at Colony 4, where if we see Elma and Lyn again, Lyn will know how to make the Scow flight module and Elma can give you a complete plot summary of Xenoblade X. I wonder if this dichotomy could affect hindsight opinions on things, because losing specific versions of the characters we went through the game with, though those characters all still exist and may recover those memories eventually, is very different from losing the world the first game took place in, one that was built up as basically the most important character in the game, in a way that seems like it won't be able to come back. Another big difference is that a lot more people seem to understand what happens in Chapter 13 compared to the ending of base Xenoblade 3. I may be misremembering, but I seem to recall a large percentage of complaints about 3's ending back in the day being either people saying they didn't understand what happened, or having a complaint about a certain thing happening, and then that thing is something that just didn't happen and they were misinterpreting something. This does not really happen at all in X. The things people seem to be confused about with Chapter 13 are specific details, and not the overall sequence of events. Regarding XDE, you're much more likely to see someone say something that boils down to, I understand what happened in the epilogue and I don't like that it happened, where early on with 3, you were much more likely to see something along the lines of, I don't understand what happened and I don't like that the game wasn't clear. In 3's case, a lot of things have mitigated this over time. The first is just that eventually some people did figure out the confusing things, and through word of mouth and content creators, that eventually was spread around, and people who were confused were able to learn what was going on. The second is Future Redeemed happened and expanded on a lot of things, as well as just straight up giving a second view of the ending, and then also the art book came out and had a few more clarifications and explanations. While the accessibility of the art book info can definitely be criticized, it did genuinely cover the entire spectrum of what people were confused about, ranging from yes, Lands is in fact a machina, which was pretty obvious, to yes, Malos was in End's Sword of the End, which was a very popular fan theory but had no explicit confirmation in the base game or future deemed, to Fiora and only Fiora was in Lucky 7, which I think I'm safe to say literally nobody got right, given how even the other developers in the interview were surprised by this when Tetsuya Takahashi brought it up. None of this has really happened with XDE yet, and I am including myself in there. After publishing, I realized that I waited a lot longer to make my Xenoblade 3 ending video than I did to make my Xenoblade X epilogue video, so there's a very, very good chance that the things I said in there will not hold up as well as the stuff in the 3 one did, and either my opinions and interpretations will change, or further investigation or developer statements will just straight up confirm some things I said were wrong. I can't really recommend the Xenoblade 3 ending video as anything other than a time capsule now because it's outdated, but in the X video's case, I might stop recommending it much sooner than that purely because I now disagree with some things I said there. Like, I already had it pointed out that I somehow forgot that your voice is not a duet, so it could get pretty dire for that video in the future. Also, word of mouth and videos by content creators can only spread so far when not a lot of people have even beaten the base game yet and gotten to the new epilogue content. The people who are most likely to have seen the new ending by now are the people who are the most hardcore Xenoblade X fans, who are also the people who are the most predisposed to dislike the new ending. And on top of that, people trying to avoid spoilers are just not really talking about the game much at all, so the usual big interconnectedness that allows information to spread is not there right now, which means things like in-depth discussions or YouTube videos are not going to be shared as much as they will in the future when the majority of the community has finished the game. This, though, is where we do run into a potential problem. A lot of the opinion shift on Xenoblade 3's ending came because of post-release information, and I don't know how much of that we're going to be getting with XDE. I think it's pretty unlikely we're going to get an art book other than maybe a reprinting of the original one that moves some of the concept art to different locations because it was used in the epilogue. And is there going to be a new developer interview just for what is largely a reprint of an old book? There's not going to be a Future Redeemed to expand on the ending because this was the Future Redeemed for X. Is there going to be any developer interview in a magazine or something like that that specifically talks about this kind of thing, and not whatever they have in store next for the series? There's a very good chance that we're not going to get any sort of official follow-up on any of the confusing things, or any of the things people didn't like about the ending, until the next Xenoblade game that follows up on that ending. And we don't even know if it's going to be the next Xenoblade game, period. That, I think, is the main difference, and why I think this is so worth talking about. I think the overall legacy of X Chapter 13 is going to be almost entirely dependent on what the next couple games in the series are. If I'm being honest, if there's no Xenoblade X2 or similar game at some point during the Switch 2 generation, I think my opinion of the epilogue is just gonna straight up freefall. I am personally of the opinion that they left a lot of outs and a lot of potential threads that could be picked up on in a flat-out sequel to Xenoblade X, and if they don't do that and make a proper next-generation open-world Xenoblade game, then yeah, that really all will have been for nothing. I do want the games to be connected. I want the Xenoblade X cast to meet the cast from the other games, but whenever I hear people suggest that, oh, there's not going to be an X2, they're just going to make Xenoblade 4 and that will have characters and things from X in it, I just straight up dislike that. Numbered Xenoblade and X are two completely different kinds of game. Yeah, Xenoblade 3 got a lot closer to X than the other two games did, and I think that is largely because a lot of concepts that were originally pitched for X got reused there, but it is still a very different kind of game, and there's a not insignificant amount of people who disliked the X-like elements that were introduced to it. I think making the next game a combination of both the numbered games and X would alienate the two sides of people who greatly prefer one formula to the other, while also providing a diluted version of both for the people who do like both, which means no one is going to be happy. If X characters are reduced to cameos in Xenoblade 4, which happens to have a slightly more non-linear structure than 1, 2, and 3 did, then yeah, it was completely pointless destroying Mira and all of that, because they didn't do anything interesting with that, and didn't keep X as its own unique special thing. And considering it has been 10 years since the last one, I think we are due for a new Xenoblade X style game. especially if the next 3D Zelda is not going to be using a similar format to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Also, like, the original X was absurdly impressive on the Wii U, and barely any less so on the Switch. It would be a complete waste of the Switch 2's jump in power, which is like the most substantial between two Nintendo systems since before I could talk, to not make a game that's that big of a flex again, especially now that they'll have so much more power, so many more resources and people to work on it, and so many more eyes looking on them and waiting to see what they'll do next than they ever did in 2015. This is partially why I'm leaning slightly towards preferring if the planet is not the one from the ending of Future Redeemed. Could they make a pure Xenoblade X2 about the cast of the White Whale 2, landing on that planet from Future Redeemed, exploring it like they did Mira, and eventually running into other people from the other games? Yes, absolutely, but at that point, you're just doing the big Avengers crossover of all of Xenoblade much later than the people who wanted that to happen with Xenoblade 3 would have wanted it to happen, and there are so many people who just don't want that to happen at all. Plus, if the big climax of your Xenoblade X game is, hey, look at these characters from the other Xenoblade games, that's not gonna feel great for the Xenoblade X fans who already felt burned by the epilogue. That's one criticism of Chapter 13 I just straight up don't understand. They did not sacrifice anything from X for the purposes of fan service for the other games. In fact, I'm kind of inclined to applaud their restraint when it comes to that. There were very few scenes that were overt fan service to that. All of the Xenoblade 3 B-side stuff was genuine substance and one of my favorite parts of the epilogue. And the only direct impact the events of the numbered games are even implied to have had on X is maybe Void getting released from his prison. Yeah, they're probably coming together in the future, but that hasn't happened yet, so I can't really critique the execution of that until it does. Basically, if they never make an X2, or if the core conceit of X2 is, we're building up this world Klaus destroyed but came back after Xenoblade 3 and Future Redeemed just like we did Mira, then yeah, that would be just reducing X to fodder for the other games and taking all of the interesting things it established, including the new Threads Chapter 13 setup, and just strip mining them to make more things for Shulk to do. If X2 does exist, is a proper open world game, is an interplanetary adventure like people have been wanting, again, ever since the idea of an X2 ever came up, and one of those planets happens to be the Future Redeemed planet, that's a completely different story. If the Samarians and the Ghosts are the big overarching plot lines for the entire series, and the X characters are still important and elevated and put on the same level as the other characters, that is also a completely different story. I used Avengers crossover as a comparison before, but I think that is a somewhat apt way to view it. Numbered Xenoblade and X can absolutely coexist as two parallel comic runs about two different casts in the same universe. Have crossover between them, like characters can show up in between them and not be a major focus or super big deal, and they can just keep going, doing their own things with their own tone and their own formulas, and then later on, come together and properly cross over in a full thing to deal with a new overarching villain that threatens all of them. That I would be okay with, because it allows X to keep its identity without being absorbed into the rest of the series, while also preventing that absorption from getting in the way of what makes the numbered games good. Honestly, bonus points if this new overarching plotline actually comes from the X side of things, and especially if it is just something about the Samarians or Ghosts, because those are things that already existed long before Chapter 13. It's not even, they just invented this new thing to make X relevant to the epilogue, it's this thing that's been around since the original X is now coming to the forefront, and the X characters are now some of the most important characters around because of that. This is going to be one of my most repeated talking points when it comes to future X games for the foreseeable future. They can rotate out certain characters from main cast positions in future X games to keep things fresh. Yelv has probably the biggest cliffhanger in the original game that was not addressed at all in DE, not that I was really expecting it to be. But if they make him a main character in X2, now we can dive into that with a whole lot more detail than we would if he was just another optional party member with a couple affinity missions. There are also 3 brand new characters introduced as party members in DE, and Neil, Nell, and Liesel are definitely uncontroversially popular, so I'd be very surprised if a sequel doesn't build off of that and rotate them into the main cast. It's very possible all 3 of the new characters are in DE purely as setup for a future game. I'm not sure how much more Arena, Doug, Gwen, and characters like them can bring to the main cast, But on the other hand, Nail's entire deal is exploring planets and trying to find things. So if that's what X2 is about, exploring many planets in a new universe, trying to find traces of Samar, that could be amazing. I don't think we're ever getting rid of Elma, Lynn, and Al as main characters, because they just kind of are the three most important characters in Xenoblade X. And I'm completely fine with that. I love Lynn. Al needs to stay around because the Ares needs to stay around for something in the future, and I like him from what I've seen of him so far too. And then Elma, she did explain some of her backstory, but we don't know all the details about her yet, and that's really interesting. We learned the vague broad strokes of where she came from, but we don't know what her childhood was like or anything like that. And that's something that's ripe for exploration and could absolutely be really interesting. Ultimately though, the one thing that gives me a lot of hope there will be a proper X2 in the future is the fact that Cross survived. It would have been so easy to have them sacrifice themselves in the final battle, similar to how Al did, but they don't come back because they don't have the Ares. Everyone on the White Whale 2 makes it to the new universe, they land on the future Deemed planet, and that's it for unique Xenoblade X stuff. Those guys are just gonna be in the background of future games where they'll all talk about Rook, their friend who died so that everyone else could live. But they don't do that. Not only does Cross survive, they're the one Al, and by extension the Ares itself, choose to pilot it during the final battle against Void over even Elma, who had flown it before. They're all of a sudden able to pull out moves that took Al the Ares to use with a generic Skell, and then they survive, which means if X characters show up again, they're going to have to write around why Cross doesn't appear or just actually have the Avatar character on screen. While I would ultimately be okay with them never fully explaining what Cross's deal is, they did ultimately add a bit more intrigue to their true identity in the epilogue, so it does genuinely seem like something is being cooked about them. Ultimately speaking, while the Switch 1 generation was a very long one by Nintendo standards, it did have 2 new Xenoblade games. It also had 2 definitive editions, and now every single game in the Xenoblade series is available on one platform, and via backwards compatibility, they'll all be on Switch 2 as well. I'm gonna be real, I don't think Xenoblade 2 DE is happening. If it gets an updated version for its 10th anniversary like 1 and X did, I think it'll probably just be a paid Nintendo Switch 2 version that includes enhancements and quality of life fixes, without even a new piece of story content because Torna already exists. The only relevant definitive edition Monolith even possibly could still make is the Xenosaga trilogy, and while I do think that's going to happen, I couldn't tell you if Monolith is going to be the primary developer on it or not, so I do genuinely think it's safe to say that even if the Switch 2 generation is shorter, we will still see 2 brand new Xenoblade games on it. I'm just hoping that one of those is a proper Xenoblade X2 that follows up on the epilogue in such a satisfactory way that everyone can look back and say that they like it more now. I know it's a bit redundant telling Xenoblade X fans to expect to wait, but I also would not be surprised if X2 is not the first new Xenoblade game for the Switch 2, so while it might be a hot couple million minutes until we actually see that new game, I am still cautiously optimistic there will be at least a Xenoblade X2 in the coming generation, even if it's not quite called that, even if it might be more of a spiritual follow-up, and even if it doesn't pull off that whole epilogue reframing thing. But until next time, which hopefully you won't have to wait as long as an X2 for, this is Luxon, signing off.